Hello, and welcome back to the Law News Network. I'm your host, Caroline Polisi, here for the morning, and we are on verdict watch in the Holly Bobo trial. That's the trial of Zach Adams for the brutal rape, murder, and kidnapping of 20-year-old nursing student Holly Bobo. I've just heard that the jury was late getting in today, but they have arrived at the courthouse. Security is really heating up there in the Hardin County Courthouse. We are very excited to have with us today Leah Beth, a reporter for Fox 13 Memphis. Hi, Leah. How are you?
Hi. I'm great. Thanks for having me.
We're ecstatic to have you here because you are really on the ground there. In fact, Leah's been living out of her car for a while. She's really, talk about on the scene. I mean, she has been covering this case gavel to gavel. So just tell us a little bit about what's the feeling like outside the courthouse. What do you get a sense for?
Well, I'll tell you, I think everyone's really anxious for this. And just to give you a little bit of background, too, just for how long I've covered this. Well, and I shouldn't even say as a reporter, because I haven't been a reporter for as long as I've covered this. I'm originally from Jackson, Tennessee, which is just a couple of counties over from where Holly Bobo was abducted. And I was her age at the time that it happened.
Oh, wow.
And so it really shook the entire community as well as all of West Tennessee, because it was so odd that something like that had happened in such a rural area.
Right.
So, I mean, even in my case, I had, grandparents saying, don't leave the house, because at the time we didn't know if there was just a kidnapper on the loose or exactly what had happened. So this has been really close to us for a very, very long time. In the last, I guess we're on day 11 now, I think, of the trial. You can tell that the anxiety is building. People are really anxious for a verdict. And I'll be honest, I'm really surprised that more people are not coming out and saying, I think he's guilty, I think he's innocent, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people are really confused about where this is going to go. And I think that's why they're so anxious for a verdict, is because it could really go any way. Of course, it's always like that in any case, but I think a lot of times when you watch them, especially from the outside looking in, you've made up your mind by this point.
Right.
And I think in this particular case, there are a lot of people who are still wondering exactly what's going to happen.
And we are doing a verdict poll here at LawNewz. Go to our Twitter feed. You can vote right now. We have so far, 77% of you voted guilty, 13% of you voted not guilty, and 10% are undecided. Of course, I always like to tell people, a lot of people say, well, what about the vote for innocent? There is no innocent vote here. It's either guilty or not guilty. Remember, it's the burden on the prosecution to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense has no burden to prove innocence, merely to show reasonable doubt that perhaps there is a question as to whether or not the defendant is guilty. So I always think that's important to point out. We're here with Leah Beth, a reporter for Fox 13 Memphis. And so, Leah, we just heard the prosecution's I'm taking our viewers back sort of to the beginning of this case. We heard the prosecutor's opening arguments, really laying out their whole theory here is that Zach Adams is the perpetrator of this crime. There were several other sort of bad people involved. This is a world of drugs, of meth and morphine. These people did bad things. They're bad people. And this is sort of the life that they lead. And these are the sort of necessary repercussions of that lifestyle. You heard from the prosecution saying that Jason Autry was going to be sort of their star witness, and they really delivered on that, I thought. A lot of our viewers here felt like Jason Autry was a very compelling witness, even though, obviously, again, the prosecution still classifying Jason Autry as a bad man. However, we all know bad people can tell the truth on the stand, good people can lie on the stand, and the prosecution is really hoping that the jury believes Jason Autry in this instance, because that's the narrative they're going with. They're sticking to Jason Autry's story, and the defense, we just heard opening arguments from the defense there, really trying to poke some holes there. What do you think? Do you think the defense sort of lived up to its promise to the jury, which you just heard in the openings? What do you make of the defense case here?
Well, I think that the defense, especially after hearing closing arguments yesterday, did a really good job of poking those holes and creating some doubt. You have to remember, too, that we heard a lot from investigators with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and we had one agent in particular, Agent Terry Dykes, was on this case up until 2013, and then he was removed from the case. In the state's rebuttal, before we got to closing, we heard from his supervisor, and that was the first time that we had ever actually heard, why he was removed from the case. We've always heard rumors of why Terry Dykes was removed from the case, but we've never really been able to confirm that. And he did confirm for us that he thought that Terry Dykes had tunnel vision, those were his words, and that he had lost focus on other suspects in the case and had only focused on one suspect, and that's Terry Britt. And I think Terry Britt has probably brought a lot of doubt into the mind of the jury as well. He is a registered sex offender from that area. He is currently in jail on other charges, but has served time for, and I'm not completely exact on exactly what those charges were, but I do know that he has served time for attempted kidnapping as well as rape. So they focused on him for a very long time, and for the first time in the history of the state of Tennessee, they wiretapped his phones and investigated him that way. And then Terry Dykes was removed from the case, and that's when the focus switched over into Zach Adams and his brother Dylan, as well as Jason Autry and Shane Austin, who we all know committed suicide in 2015.
Right.
So I think that the defense has done a really good job of creating doubt in the mind of the jurors, because the investigators have admitted that they dropped the ball. And so we don't have any DNA evidence in this case because they were not fully investigated for years after her disappearance. I mean, think about how much time that gives to somebody to be able to cover something up.
Exactly. Yeah, and we heard from the defense right there in openings. I think she referred to it as a big old goose egg, which is what sort of the prosecution had in terms of DNA evidence, because there really are no forensics in this case. You heard her really hammering home. They carved out, a whole portion of Zach Adams' floor. They tore up his floor to the ground in an effort to try to find something, any type of DNA evidence that would point to him as the perpetrator of this crime, but they simply could not. And we've talked about this a lot on the Law News Network. Juries like forensics. They like direct evidence. I mean, of course, it is well within their rights as jurors and within the criminal justice system to convict on circumstantial evidence, and it has been done before. However, we all know that it's a much stronger case with that DNA forensic analysis. So, Dykes, tell me a little bit more. I'm interested. He had blinders, but he got up there really kind of, in my opinion, he testified to some things that I think he shouldn't necessarily have testified to in terms of sort of the cell phone analysis and really getting on there as more of an expert. Do you think he made a compelling case for this alternate theory?
I think that you have to keep in mind that he is not a cell phone expert.
Right.
And there was a lot of argument back and forth about cell phone experts. I don't. For those of you that were watching on the last day of the defense's witnesses and testimony, they said. At one point, they brought up somebody that the judge actually ruled was not an expert and could not testify as an expert, which I thought was really interesting. And actually, twice that day, the judge said to the state and the defense, please don't argue in front of the jury, because they were going back and forth over this. So as far as Terry Dykes is concerned, I mean, what an interesting character to have on the stand. Certainly as a reporter, I would call him Soundbite City, because he had so many things to say where they're just jaw dropping. At one point, the defense asked him, what was the conclusion that you came to after investigating these four men, referring to the Adams and Autry and Austin? And he said, I was wasting my time investigating these idiots. Right. And boy, that was a jaw-dropping moment, I think. Yeah. And he still maintains that Terry Britt is the man that's responsible for this crime. So, and it's hard for me to say from the outside looking in. I wasn't investigating this every day of my life for 2 years like he was. And keep in mind that when he was taken off the case, there was no body. Her remains had not been found at that point. So, I think that as far as the TBI is concerned, maybe he did not give them the best look, but he did retire from the TBI that same year. He's actually an attorney here in Savannah. I'm literally looking at his office right now.
Wow.
It's right in front of me.
Wow.
So.
Yeah, he was quite a character. And I thought that, it was kind of an interesting move for him too. I think that was a calculated move on his part to call the guys idiots. He wants to show the jury that he, has no dog in this fight in terms of he doesn't like these guys. He thinks that they're morons, horrible people, drug addicts, what have you. He just doesn't think that they perpetrated this particular crime. Anyway, our viewers kind of went crazy over his testimony. Very, very interesting. And you raise you reference another point, which is this arguing in front of the jury, because throughout the duration of this trial, almost all of the arguments have taken place in the presence of the jury, which is just mind-boggling to an attorney. It's highly prejudicial. I think the defense attorney, we've really been giving her a hard time, but she's faced really an uphill battle in this trial from start to finish. It's pretty clear the judge is not on her side here. He's ruling in favor of the prosecution almost on every single objection. How do you think that that's played to the jury in terms of how they see sort of the defense case?
Well, I'm sure that has complicated matters for them, just because it at the end of the day, and again, I'm not an attorney, I'm a reporter, right. But I do believe that it's complicated things for them, and it's heightened the sense of emotion in the courtroom, because even yesterday in closing, the state prosecutor Jennifer Nichols, she was very emotional. I mean, she's been very close with the Bobos now, and she said at one point, talking about Holly's ID, she held up her ID and she said, her license says that she was 5'3". We like to call her 5'3" of country, and she said "we" as in, and looked at the Bobos, like. It's almost like she was referring to Holly as family herself, because she's so close with them. And so I think that's added emotion. And so then when the defense is fighting, when they're fighting back and forth, I can't imagine being a juror and watching that. I know it's going to happen. It's bound to happen. But I'm sure that it's created a lot of confusion in their minds, on top of all the confusion that they've had with the difference in testimony and whatnot. I mean, don't even get me started on the cell phone stuff, because
I know. We'll get there.
My head was spinning.
Mine too. If ours were spinning, obviously I think maybe the jury's was as well.
Yeah, I think you're right.
You mentioned the closing arguments, and I want to talk about that because, the prosecutor in her rebuttal closing looked Zach Adams right in the eye, and that's highly unusual, I think, for a prosecutor to do in closing, and it took a lot of guts. And I think everyone here at LawNewz and our viewers were really sort of taken aback by just how, as you said, just how emotional that closing was. Do you think that was effective?
I certainly do, and it affected me. I can tell you that much. I mean, and I will say this too. I was not in the actual courtroom for that part of the closing arguments with their rebuttal, but I was in the courtroom for the first time, because we're kind of off in a media room where we can watch and where we can live tweet and whatnot. I was off in the media room for most of the trial, but then for the first part of the closing arguments, I was in the courtroom, and that's a bold move. This is not a very large courtroom. Yep. I know when people watch these like big, massive trials on television, it looks like these courtrooms are huge, and they're not. I mean, they were within a matter of steps from each other. I would have paid big money to be able to see the reaction on his face when she did that. But I absolutely think that affected the jury, and it was just a very emotional part of the testimony. The arguments, closing arguments, because you have to keep in mind, right before that, she had really walked through the last moments of Holly's life. She even unpacked her lunchbox that they found, and as a reporter, I have to try to stifle my opinion on these things, but I was really holding back tears watching that. I mean, it really got to me, and knowing that Holly's parents were sitting right there watching that happen, and the states referring to how she would probably be married to her boyfriend, Drew Scott, by now, and probably be living near them and, being a nurse. That was very effective for her to go that route and then to point at him and say, and that's the man who did it. People don't just disappear.
Right.
I got to hand it to her. Like
yeah.
that was some really, that was a really strong closing argument, I thought.
Yeah. And Leah, you mentioned the Bobos, and they've been here throughout the duration of the trial. We heard from Karen Bobo, obviously. We heard from many of the Bobos. And we heard just now, when we're going back playing opening arguments, which I think was interesting, we just heard the defense's opening arguments state that, initially the Bobos sort of were under suspicion for somehow being involved in this crime. And we heard from Karen Bobo state that she did in fact lie to police about the age of her daughter. And the reason being is that she didn't believe that they would put out an Amber Alert if the police didn't think that she was below a certain age. So she told the police that she was in fact 17. We now know, of course, she's 20. But rumors are circulating and people are asking questions. Well, would that be enough to classify her as being sort of uncooperative with police? And so there's this question of whether or not the Bobos themselves were in fact cooperating with police. And then my own personal intrigue comes in with Clint Bobo. Can you talk to me about Clint Bobo? Because we heard from Jason Autry. He got on the stand and said that Zach Adams told him that Zach was at the Bobo house that day to teach Clint how to cook meth. So, we've heard varying stories from different sides of the table here, and so far we haven't really been able to confirm anything. What are you hearing on the ground about Clint Bobo?
That's the number one question I get asked. What about Clint?
Yeah.
What about Clint? What about Clint? Here's the deal with Clint. I think hindsight is 20/20, right? You see something like that happening, you maybe don't react as quickly as people wish that you had. Do you know how many times a day I think back to myself, boy, I wish I'd handled that differently, or I wish I'd done something differently with this, that, or the other. Granted, I haven't had a sister that's been abducted, but in that moment, I can understand that he didn't react quite as quickly as maybe people think that he would have.
Right.
Please keep in mind that Darden, Tennessee is very rural. Very rural.
Yep.
This is not the kind of place where somebody just you would think that somebody would just walk right up and take your sister out of the garage. And so he thought that it was her boyfriend at the time. He called his mother. We heard Karen Bobo say that Clint called and said, where is Holly? Is she supposed to go hunting with? Hold on just a second. I apologize. My phone is ringing, and I just want to be sure it's not because... Oh, no, it's
okay.
not. I'm so paranoid there's going to be a verdict, and then I'm going to have to run.
Please. We want to know. We're on pins and needles here. We want to know, too, so please take that call.
Every time my phone rings,
we would love
I'm
to
panicked.
hear it.
So anyways, Jason Autry is the only person that we heard that testimony from, that Clint had any connection to drugs, that had any connection to any of them. We have never heard that corroborated by any other person on the stand at any point. Every single TBI agent that got up there on the stand, including Terry Dykes, he used the words ridiculous. He said, that's ridiculous.
Right.
He even pointed to the fact that, I think Clint had admitted to smoking pot 3 times in his life, and that's it, that he had no involvement in that. And so, I just think it's really easy to want to point a finger, but as the state, or actually it was the defense that pointed out in their closing yesterday that he would have no reason to protect Jason Autry in this. So he would admit he would admit to using drugs and knowing them somehow if it would mean bringing his sister back.
Well, that's the question, right? And just to point out for our viewers, you can believe Jason Autry's testimony. You can credit Jason Autry with being a credible witness, even if this Clint sort of narrative, this counter narrative about Clint sort of being involved with the Adams brothers, with Shane Austin, even if you don't believe that, it could very well have been that Zach Adams, in fact, was the one lying to Jason Autry. So I think, that's an important point to clarify. Even if you don't believe that, Clint was involved here, you can still credit that testimony of Jason Autry saying that Zach Adams told him that, because Zach Adams could have been lying to Jason Autry at the time, right?
Right. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, because again, I'm not an attorney, but I was kind of surprised there wasn't an objection to that. But, I mean, because I guess that that's kind of hearsay. Am I
Kind
wrong
of,
there?
yeah. I mean, there have been so many hearsay issues in this case. That's another, it's really been a kangaroo court. It's been a circus in there. And, one of the things we've been drilling away at the defense attorney is she really hasn't raised many objections to all of this hearsay evidence that's coming in. Remember, just for our viewers, hearsay is an out-of-court statement entered for the truth of the matter asserted. Of course, if you've been to law school, you know that there are trucks that can be driven through those exceptions. The exceptions are a mile wide, and we get hearsay into the courtroom all the time. But the idea is that they're being brought in for a limited purpose, the purpose of which is not to show the truth of the matter asserted, but rather to show some other thing. Now, the prosecution has merely been sort of getting it in there saying, well, Your Honor, it's not for the truth of the matter, but then not going forward to state what it actually is for. And everybody knows it's for the prejudicial nature of that testimony. You can't get in, typically you can't get that stuff in there because it's unreliable. It's inherently unreliable, and the justice system has made a decision to exclude that type of testimony. So, but however, it's been all over the place in this court. And the poor defense attorney, she raised objections early on in the case, but she kind of stopped by the end.
Yeah.
She kind of was defeated, just stopped making the objections and really not having that record for review on appeal. So, a lot of legal experts have been saying that this is a case ripe for appellate review, certainly. And I agree. I think if there is a conviction in this case, we will see it definitely go up on appeal. But just changing gears a little bit, and thank you for that insight into Clint. What about the Bobo family? I mean, we never really got to the bottom of why it was. If you'll remember, there was an investigator up on the stand that had written some notes. The defense attorney sort of, there was a gotcha moment where in this investigator's notes, they had written that the Bobo family had not, in fact, been cooperative with them. But we never really heard. I mean, it seems a little far-fetched that just simply that lying about Holly's age initially for the Amber Alert, that would be enough to warrant that kind of a description. Do we know anything else about the Bobo's families potentially not being cooperative with police investigators here?
Nothing in particular. The only other thing that stood out for me is when we did hear from Karen Bobo that she was really checking up on people herself. She even said that she had business cards made at one point that had her phone number on it so that she could pass it to people. Because remember, she had spoken to Jason Autry. Yes. I think before investigators even had. And she also spoke to Zach Adams. And he hugged her, and then, this is what Jason Autry claims, is that Zach Adams had hugged her, and then he said something, he told Jason Autry that he was worried that she didn't believe him, and actually, now that I'm saying that, I don't think that was Jason Autry. It was another one of the friends. We went through a lot of friends that the state brought up on Monday. I think that's the only other thing that we've heard about them being quote-unquote uncooperative. Okay. I think that you have to. And again, this is me coming from the standpoint of just a normal citizen, not someone that's a legal expert. But I think that you have to imagine what it would be like to be living in that very, very small town. And for your 20-year-old daughter to go missing and still be missing for months and years. I think you get to the point where you're like, okay, well, nobody else is doing anything. And so I'm going to figure it out on my own. Yeah. And I feel pretty confident in saying that I would be doing the same thing if my 20-year-old daughter was missing and she still wasn't home 3 and 4, 5. Now here we are 6 years later, and it took us until 2014 to even find her remains. Right. So that's really the only other mention of them being uncooperative, I think, for the most part, that they have been. I do know that they hired an attorney when they started looking into Clint Bobo, and I've had a couple people say that, that's suspicious, but no, I think as a defense attorney, I always like to sort of stand up for people that hire an attorney because people run to the conclusion that just because you retain counsel that you have something to hide or you are guilty. We know in this country that people are convicted of crimes for which they did not commit all the time. It's just prudent to hire a lawyer when any part of investigation gets even close to you. So it does not mean just because you lawyer
lawyer up does not mean that you're guilty. I always like to
Sure.
to plug
Sure.
that.
And I think that was smart on their part to do that, because they, in their mind, they're going, okay, well, we've lost one daughter. We don't know where she is. We're still looking for her. And now they're coming after our son, who they clearly believed and believe still now is innocent. And I will tell you, I this is a very small courthouse.
Right.
Things get a little awkward, even for the media. We are very close to that courtroom, and even when you want to go to the restroom, I mean, you're standing in line with them right there. I've stood in line to go to the restroom with Clint and his wife on multiple occasions this week.
Wow.
So you're very close to everyone while you're here.
Well, it's an interesting point. They're all close there, but also aren't all of these defendants and on the prosecution side, aren't they related as well? Can you
Yeah.
do you have,
Yeah,
I mean, I wish we could sort of draw, one of those relationship trees, but talk to us about that. How unusual is that, or is that kind of typical for sort of small town rural Tennessee?
Yeah, welcome to Decatur County.
Okay.
I mean, that's just kind of how that goes. I can say the same thing from where I am. I can be standing in a gas station somewhere and somebody says, oh, I'm your dad's third cousin, and I'm like, oh, okay, I didn't know we were related. That's just kind of how that works. And it is. I just like to paint the picture for people, because a lot of people don't understand what that area that she's from. It is so small. It is so rural. It is truly kind of the middle of nowhere. I actually went it's been a week ago, last Friday. We heard Jason Autry testify on Thursday about the barn on Shane Austin's grandmother's property, where Autry claims that Dylan, Zach, and Shane Austin raped Holly Bobo after she was abducted. And that when the TBI finally went to investigate that barn, once they had started looking into them, this is 3 years later, it was no longer standing. I went to that land on Friday to get a better idea of just how close that is. And it is on Yellow Springs Road, and it's on that same property where Shane Austin's trailer was. It's no longer standing there. And I would say that it's less than a mile from Yellow Springs Church, which is where we heard Jason Autry say that they met at one point with her body in the back of the truck in the quilt. That's also where one of the command centers was when they were searching for her. This is very close. This is insanely close to one another, this church and where this barn would have been standing. But just to give you an idea of how rural it is, I had no cell phone service where I was. I mean, I couldn't even figure out where I was, because you just drop service there. And I think that's another thing to keep in mind with these cell phone pings and whatnot as well, that cell phone service there is really shoddy. So it's they pointed that out too. That cell phone expert said at one point, this is 2011. People didn't have GPS tracking systems in their phones like they do now. It's not the same as it was then. So anyways, this is just a very, very small town, I guess, is my whole, to wrap that up.
Yes.
That's my whole point. It's very, very small, and it's easy to know everyone and for everyone to be quote unquote in your business.
Yeah. Leah Beth, reporter for Fox 13 Memphis, thank you as always for your insights into this trial. Great on the ground reporting. We appreciate you coming on to LawNewz and discussing this case with us. We're going to
I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah, thanks. We're going to throw to